And a surprise announcement just before Absa released its half-year results yesterday morning. The group said Arrie Rautenbach would relinquish his CEO and executive director roles from mid-October, followed by 6 months of contractually enforced gardening leave. Absa's share price jumped 5% to 165 Rand and 45 cents, despite the unexpected departure of its CEO and its interim results, which showed a 5% fall in headline earnings. To help us try and make sense of the developments, we are joined by Rob Rose, who is a writer at the Financial Times. Rob, thank you so much for your time. I mean, were you surprised by this news, and how did you read that statement?
Afternoon, Nastasia. Yeah, I mean, I do think it was a bit of a surprise. I mean, I think that, there were stories about what was happening there, and clearly a lot of people were displeased with the level of transformation in the bank and what had been happening. But generally, you expect bankers, especially at Absa, to hunker down and work through the hard stuff. So I think it was premature, especially given the fact that Absa's had 5 CEOs in 4 years. It really can't afford more crises at the top, and that's exactly what it's done. And it's focused attention on just how unstable Absa has been for the last couple of years. And it's the share price has reacted positively. But it does illustrate really problems in the boardroom.
It's quite interesting that the share price reacted positively, but you would think that the share price would go down because it's now giving this message of leadership instability at a time where Absa needs to try and focus on what it wants to do post a Maria Ramos 2019 departure.
Well, absolutely. I mean, possibly you could say that what's now happened is that there's a sense that Absa might be able to resolve the problems and resolve what was clearly a very fraught leadership team. Clearly, there was displeasure with Arrie Rautenbach, and it was never an easy time for him. There were various factions in the bank's leadership team for years already. And perhaps this is a sense that this is a chance to put that right. But like you say, equally, it does illustrate that the bank is... it doesn't quite know what it is. It's suffering through an identity crisis. It used to be the country's biggest home loan bank, biggest retail bank, and that's slipped a lot during the Barclays years. And it's in its attempt to get that back, it seems to have sacrificed a bit of stability at the top, which you haven't had at somewhere like Standard Bank, for example, where Sim Tshabalala's been in charge for many years. You haven't really had that at First Rand, which has had a fairly orderly succession, and certainly at Nedbank just took Jason Quinn from Absa, who could himself have been in Arrie Rautenbach's shoes. That's a big loss because Jason Quinn was a really highly regarded banker, and he's done pretty well for Nedbank so far. Nedbank's share price is up 45% over the past year compared to Absa, which is down 5%.
Speaking to a different analyst, I mean, he kind of used a soccer analogy. He's like, it's pretty much similar to Man United having 6 or 7 coaches in 4 years. Do you blame the club or do you blame the coach? In this case, do you blame the board or is it just, I don't know, the CEO here?
Well, I mean, the board, I do think, there are questions to be asked of that board. They hired Daniel Manele from the Reserve Bank, and that didn't last very long. And to some extent, that's because there was a sense that he wasn't able to set his own strategy, that the board said, well, this is the strategy and Daniel must just execute it. No, I don't know any CEO that goes into a company and thinks, I'm just going to do this and I'm not going to have any say in how it's run. I mean, that doesn't work like that. So I think that there are questions to be asked of that board. And, certainly they've got questions to answer if you have, 5 CEOs in 4 years. It's unstable. What is their strategy to stamp its authority back in the retail banking sphere? It hasn't answered that cohesively either.
I know Charles Russon has stepped in as interim CEO, and what we know about him is that he used to be the CEO of CIB, which is the largest contributor, an important contributor, at least within Absa's earnings. If we do cement the position of CEO, whether it's Charles Russon or somebody else, what should be the immediate point of work? Is it uniting what comes across as 2 different factions within Absa about strategy?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, all the analyst reports I've read and the people I've spoken to from within Absa have talked about the fact that there are different factions in the bank, and that isn't cohesive. And there's a real sense that the bank hasn't done enough to support transformation. There were curious hires. There's been a sense of everyone, covering their own backs and looking out for themselves. So cohesiveness and unity as as you'd want from, say, Manchester United would be a good thing. Or, you could also just spend a lot like Manchester City and just, buy everyone back and buy some really good skills in. But you really have to get back to what Absa's core skill is, which was retail banking, which was home loans, which was doing very well. I mean, CIB has been very good in recent years, and I think it's one of the few parts of the bank that gained from the relationship with Absa, with Barclays. So I think that has done pretty well. But, Absa is not, it doesn't quite know where it is at the moment. And I think that's what you need to resolve.
Right. Would there be challenges here in market share? I mean, if we go back to when the strategy was trying to find itself, Jason Quinn was at Absa at the time, so was Arrie, and they were tasked with fixing this whole market share issue. As you say, going back to what Absa was, does it become a little more challenging to try and keep up here, given that the other banks would have eaten that market share?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do think they did pretty well initially. I mean, Arrie did pretty well in a couple of years ago in terms of rebuilding that post Barclays, rebuilding the kind of retail banking side. But since then, they've faced, some pretty furious competition from the likes of Time Bank, from Discovery Bank. These new startups have done fantastically well, and I think eaten into the market share. And the other banks all had their own identity to some extent. They knew what they were. I mean, Standard Bank is very clear what it is. Nedbank's on the recovery path still. I mean, they all knew what they were. So in terms of resolving Absa's market share in retail banking, it's been very difficult for it to do that. And it's a difficult time in the market. And you've had a lot of, you've had unemployment. You've had a very couple of lackluster years in the economy where you've had bad debts growing. So you have to tread carefully in that sphere. But I do think that, without core skills on the retail banking side, it's been difficult.
Okay, so as we wrap up, as we wait for how the succession plan is going to work out or who they recruit to come on board as CEO, what are you going to be paying attention to as it relates to Absa?
I mean, certainly the big focus on them has to now be what they do in the leadership position, how secure the person is, whether this resolves the internal dynamics and the internal points of contestation in the executive committee and lower down the bank. And then you'll be looking at the market share over the next couple of years to see what actually happens in that sphere and see whether they are actually going in the right direction. And to some extent, the share price is a reflection of that. You have seen the banks that are recovering well illustrating their progress in their share price, and Absa's lackluster movements over the last couple of years is also reflected in the share price. So it's been bad for shareholders, even though it's cheap. The share is cheap compared to the other banks. It still hasn't performed as many expected.
Rob, thank you so much for your time. That is Rob Rose, who is the writer at the Financial Times.